But probably more importantly, Dr. Satava introduced this concept called metrics. Now, surgery has always been a see one, do one, teach one kind of thing. And how well you're performing is certainly subjective. If the surgeon's having a bad day, you might be doing very, very bad. If your proctor's not in a good mood. Or if they're in a great mood, they might be more forgiving and kind of guide you through some of the errors you might be making. By the way, this is usually happening on real people when you're learning. So taking into account errors or things like task time, economy of motion, sort of how smooth your instruments are moving, these were all metrics, and this is what Dr. Satava introduced. Dr. Satava was later recruited by DARPA. This is a Defense Advanced Research and Planning Agency in the United States. And he was allowed to dole out about $15 million to get small companies going in surgery simulation. I didn't necessarily get to this first pot of money, but Dr. Satava did give me my very first grants. So if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have really started. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a bit. But a lot of people don't know this, but he also was very instrumental in Intuitive Surgical getting started. He helped them get a lot of their funds. So certainly a pretty amazing individual. And if you look at this list, this is a lot of the simulators that came out in the 90s, and Rick certainly had his thumbprint on many of them. Unfortunately, most of these simulators are not around anymore, and many of them were not successful. So there was a flourish of activity, but when the economy started going bad in the early 2000s, kind of when I was thinking I was going to get mine started, a lot of these companies started dying out. So what's the reason for this? We certainly knew there was a need for better surgery training. And this is a report that's pretty human. It's called To Err is Human back in 1999, where they estimated that between 17 to 29 billion a year was being wasted in the United States due to preventable medical errors. Even worse, somewhere up to 98,000 Americans were dying every year because of errors. Now, granted, these are hard, I would say it's probably worse than this, because hospitals don't come out and advertise, oh yeah, we made a lot of errors, yeah, come sue us. So that doesn't really happen. But this is a report, and it certainly raised a heck of a lot of interest. Now, it's really hard to get your head around some of these numbers. But think about, in the airline industry, if 5 747 jumbo jets crashed every single week. That's the equivalent to the medical errors that are happening. Now, these are not all surgical errors. These are sometimes prescribed drugs. There's other areas, but certainly a big percentage of these planes is medical errors. So, I think if the general public saw this many planes going down a week, there would be a really major outcry. But that's just not the way it works. Typically, things are kept very quiet. A lot of things are settled out of court. It's spread all over. So it's very difficult to keep track of the types of medical errors that happen. But they certainly happen. That's without a doubt. This is something else that may put it into perspective. When minimally invasive surgery came on the scene, in particular laparoscopic surgery, everyone realized this was going to be a revolution. Now, instead of slicing somebody open and for there to be days and days of recovery time, which is very, very painful, you could go through small, minimally invasive holes and perform the surgery. But just like I'm sure you've looked at a lot of the technologies today and said, well, geez, this is pretty complex. How the heck do I learn it? Well, the one thing that you have to be as a surgeon is confident. Unfortunately, a lot of them are too confident. So this experiment kind of says it all. There's about 150 self-proclaimed laparoscopic experts, and 82% of them could not tie a suture within 600 seconds, or about 10 minutes. Now, considering suturing is such a key part of many surgeries, you would think that if you're an expert, this is something you're going to be able to do. And this is a quote I really like from Butch. I think it gets him in a lot of trouble, frankly. But he said, we were not angels of mercy, but well-paid assassins. Believe it or not, surgeons take offense to being called assassins. But that's the reality of the situation. So here we are. We have a big problem. Everybody knows about it. So let's take 10 years later. So we're just going back to 2009. You would think that things have gotten better. Certainly industry was paying a lot of attention. They invested a lot of money because they realized that apparently if people use your surgical instruments and you kill people, that people aren't going to keep using your medical instruments. So they really invested in training. And the government itself, they put about $50 million into developing standards and quality for teaching and making sure you reached a certain standard before you could become a surgeon. But what's the result? It just got worse. The estimate is that medical errors increased by about 1% each year. So if this is all accurate, and it's hard to say really whether it is or not, there's certainly a lot of people that will argue against these reports, but this means we're over 100 million deaths a year. So I think it's safe to say that we do have an issue, but then why are there not more surgery simulation companies? A lot of them really had a hard time in the early 2000s, but there was also a reason. The simulators, frankly, just weren't that good. Surgery simulation is a very difficult problem, and the soft tissue is the hardest thing to model in the world. But the good news is simulation is finally reaching the state where it is getting very good, and it's being proven with validation studies to be a valid tool for getting up the learning curve. Better yet, you're seeing almost every university these days, if you're going to be at least recognized as a quality medical training institution, you have a patient safety center or a SIM center. A center where you can go as an individual, and sometimes you're going to have a proctor that's going to have a defined protocol on how to use these simulators, or the simulators themselves will have training protocols, so you can almost self-teach yourself in your spare time, which is usually minimal. But so it is getting better. So what really goes into a simulator? And that's really what it's all about. Now, certainly you have your visual display. You have to be able to track what your hands are doing. But in a lot of applications, it's the force feedback or the sense of touch in an application that is the real challenge. And really early, before I even started Mimic, I knew that we had to have our own haptic technology because I heard of this horror story about a company, Surgical Science, who had been licensing a product from Immersion. This is a very expensive component. It was in the almost $40,000 just for the hardware. You can imagine how hard it is to squeeze the software margin when you have to pay that much for your hardware. But worse came to worse. They developed a pretty good laparoscopic application. The company that made the hardware looked at this and said, well, this looks pretty good. So they actually started building their own. Next thing you know, they cut them off from the hardware. So they had to figure out a new way to support their simulators. So it just goes to show you one lesson is if you're going to build a product based on somebody else's technology, you better be damn sure it's going to be around for a while. But really the hard part is the software and creating realistic reactions of tissue. We had some people talk about crossing the uncanny valley. What this means is, are you going to be able to, when you're trying to emulate the body, is it going to be realistic enough so somebody can get immersed in that application? Or are they just right from the get-go going to look at it and say, this isn't realistic, I don't have to take it seriously? But really, again, back to metrics, it's really the assessment of performance that is probably the most important part of a surgery simulator. So haptics is concerned with the sense of touch. And this is a quote I really like. Touch is a symphony of sensations, a multitude of instruments contributing their voices, each in their own fashion. What this means is touch is not a single sense. It's not like vision, where you receive light waves, or hearing, where you receive sound waves. Touch is a bunch of closely related sensory mechanisms. You've got pressure, heat, texture, hardness, proprioception. You've got weight and form of objects. Essentially, this is it's a bilateral exchange of energy. You push on the environment, and it pushes back, and you react to that pushback.